Good morning. I am Michael Wasilenko. I'm the interim dean of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. And along with Will Friedman, who's the president of Public Agenda, I thank you for being with us today. I'd like to acknowledge a few special guests who are with us today. Louis Urbinas is the president of the Ford Foundation. Mitch Wallerstein, who was my predecessor dean at the Maxwell School, is here. He's now president of Baruch College. And I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of Louise and Bernard Palitz. Unfortunately, they could not be with us today, but they have funded this for Policy Breakfast for 5 years now, and it's met with some great success. I'd also like to thank the Ford Foundation for providing us with this beautiful home for our breakfast series. And the incoming dean of the Maxwell School, Jim Steinberg, who is now Deputy Secretary of the U.S. State Department, has told me to send his regards to all of you. He will be coming in July, starting the job, and I'm looking forward to working with him. Now let me introduce our gifted interviewer. Robert Siegel is the senior host of National Public Radio's All Things Considered, and Robert's also been with us from the beginning of this Policy Breakfast series. He's an award-winning journalist with National Public Radio for over 3 decades. He started his professional radio right here in New York at WRVR Radio, following graduation from Columbia University and Stuyvesant High School. Robert has reported from all over the world on every issue you can imagine, and no one does it better than he does. We're very fortunate to have him as a regular moderator for our series. And now let me turn it over to you, Robert, and you can introduce David Brooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Hi. I guess my mic is on. It's rather shrill. I should explain that before David Brooks became a columnist for the New York Times, and before he became Mark Shield's partner on the PBS NewsHour on Fridays, he was a regular Friday guest on NPR's All Things Considered. And for more years than I can recall, I have been sharing in the duties of wrapping up the week in politics with David Brooks and his partner E.J. Dionne, who have been there forever. It's been great fun for me to look forward to on Friday every week. It's also been my pleasure to read David's columns in the Times, before that his articles in the Weekly Standard and in the Atlantic, and also his books, one of which we'll talk about a bit today, the most recent one, Social Animal. My other favorite, I should just point out about the Bobos, the bourgeois bohemians. It's a phrase that hasn't caught on as well as the blue state, red state paradigm that David wrote about for the Atlantic. But if we were in France, we'd all be talking about les bobos all the time. David has contributed a term to French public discourse, and I actually saw a very funny music video about it the other day. David Brooks is a graduate of the University of Chicago. He was born in Toronto, but grew up in part right down here in Stuyvesant Town, where I grew up, and then went to high school near Philadelphia, where he gained a great deal of material that he cited in many books and columns. He is one of the most insightful and, I think, surprising columnists writing today, if not the most, and to many readers, one of the most frustrating, because conservative readers can't understand why he isn't more conservative, and liberal readers cannot understand why he's conservative in the first place. Perhaps he can shed a little bit of light on this as he is now our guest for this Maxwell Breakfast. David, please join me.
Before we start, can I describe my French book tour in 30 seconds?
Yes.
So I get there, this was for Les Bobos, and they asked me to pose naked in a bathtub full of milk for French Vogue, which I said no to. And then I'm on a talk show on TF1 at one of the French big stations, and they decide I'm so boring. One of the rock bands I'm on with during the show gets under the table and starts taking off my shoes and socks while I'm talking. And then I feel a hand reaching up my shirt, unbuttoning my buttons one at a time. I just keep babbling on. But like David Hasselhoff, I'm bigger in France than here.
So was that one of the moments that contributed to your insight in the social animal, that perhaps we are not such reasonable, rational creatures as we think, and perhaps we're guided by more emotional and less controlled impulses.
No, that came. I came to writing about emotion strictly through the studies. So I came by reason, led me to emotion. And my wife jokes that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not my natural thing. And I told Robert that joke on NPR, so I'm repeating it here.
It's long enough away. It's been enough time.
Again. The other apocryphal brain research story, I can't remember if I mentioned this, it's in the book, which is they took a bunch of middle-aged guys, put them in an fMRI machine, and had them watch a horror movie, and then had them describe their feelings toward their wives. And in both cases, the brain scans were exactly the same, just sheer terror. So I get that. But essentially, there's just been this revolution in understanding of ourselves. And in 1995, according to a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, they had no panels at the big conventions on emotion. And now I'd say about half or two-thirds of the panel are on emotion. And that's because they've understood, in large part because of Damasio's work, the centrality to emotion, that we have this idea that emotion is over here and reason is over here, and that when one is up, the other's down, and they're separate. And actually, last week I was at Harvard debating some neuroscientists, and a lot of them still had this instinct. They knew it rationally that emotion is the foundation for reason. But they had trouble putting the two systems together. But basically what emotion does is it assigns value to things. It tells you what you want. When you look at something, you will react with a desire for it or an aversion to it, with an admiration for it or contempt to it. And if you don't have that emotional repertoire, then you can't make rational decisions. And one of Damasio's patients suffered lesions in the part of the brain that processes emotion, and they were not super smart. They were incapable of making decisions because they didn't know what they wanted. And so the fundamental factor is that the things deep in our brain, which are the emotional parts, assign value to things. And what we have to do in life is not only think rationally, but before that, we have to educate our emotions through poetry, music, sports. And the more you make your emotional responses subtle and widen the repertoire of your emotions, the more rational you're going to be, not less.
Now, I should explain that the current book, The Social Animal, the new book, in it you create a fictional couple and their parents and trace them through their lives. And as things happen, you cite the neuroscientists and the psychologists and the sociologists and explaining what's going on and how these people are really acting in ways that are far less out of their immediate conscious control than we might think, and the point being that describes us. When we talked about the book, I asked you how this had affected your reporting, as you'd increasingly been moved to write this through seeing the failure of much more rational actor models of how we behave. So if we were to very carefully mine your columns over the past decade, would we see you actually writing about politics and conservatism differently, say, 10 years ago than now, as you've become more immersed in this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it grew out of policy failures. I covered the Soviet Union, which was probably the best story I ever covered, and we sent teams of economists into Russia, and we armed them with privatization plans and hard currency plans, assuming their fundamental problems were all economic. But the fundamental problem there was a lack of social trust, which meant they stole everything. And so we were oblivious to that. So covering that, I said, we're missing the core problem. Then in Iraq, which was a big trauma for a lot of us, we sent the military and were oblivious to the psychological effects of living and the cultural realities of Iraq. And I once asked a senior member of the Bush administration, I can't tell you who she was, but it was, and I said, didn't you guys kind of get the culture of Iraq wrong? And this person said, well, I don't really believe in this mushy thing called culture. I think if you change institutions, you change the culture. And that is actually the right political science answer, but it happens not to be the right one. And then so I would say in the last couple months or years, the financial crisis, if you're immersed in this work, it does not surprise you that bankers are not prudent, rational creatures that will always act intelligently, because you see how emotional contagions can sweep through a profession and cause people to misprice risk at the same time. And then if you cover this stuff, you'll see how an emotional contagion can sweep through the Middle East and cause them to change perceptions. But then fundamentally, the thing that has really affected, well, there are two areas that affected my column the most. One is different thinking about density. I wrote a book about the suburbs, celebrating the fast-growing suburbs. Now I appreciate the importance of density, face-to-face communication. I cite in the book a University of Michigan study. They took one group of people, gave them 10 minutes to solve a math problem, and said you can do it face-to-face. They gave other groups 30 minutes to solve the problem. They said you have to communicate by email. So group A with the face-to-face easily solved the math problems. Group B by email could not solve them, because so much of our communication is face-to-face by intonation of voice and things like that. And if you look at patent results, when people submit a patent application, they submit all the other patents that contributed to their innovation. And an astounding number of these were invented by inventors who lived within 25 miles of the original person. We learn from the people we are right around. So importance of density. And then the final thing, which is the most important to me, is human capital formation. And that we tend to emphasize when we're raising our kids or thinking about human capital, we think about years in school, grades, SAT scores, professional skills. But the things that really matter are your ability to establish a connection with a teacher, your ability to control your impulses, your ability to establish social relationships with peers, to feel emotionally connected to an institution. All those things are trained unconsciously.
But you're using culture here interchangeably with the phenomena that you're describing. We don't examine culture by using MRIs or maybe we will someday, or by taking a survey. Is that the same thing that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about something more hardwired into us, into our psychology?
Right. No, well, I don't think there's a distinction. We have one of the big findings of the research is how much of our processing goes on unconsciously. And so the human mind can take in about 12 million pieces of information a minute, of which it can be consciously aware of 40. And so how do we process all that stuff unconsciously? Some of the information that helps us process it comes through genetics. And that's information that comes to us from thousands of years ago. But I don't think that's fundamentally different than the information that came to us from hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, which we call culture. And so we're not aware of the many ways culture shapes our perceptions. A couple quick experiments. Somebody had the bright idea of looking at people having coffee in different cultures around the world and looking how often the people having coffee reached across the table and touched each other affectionately while they were talking. And in Rio, I think there were 180 touches an hour. And in Paris, I think there were 120 touches an hour. And in London, there were 0 touches an hour. And so we don't think about that, but there's... And then another quick experiment, they took a look at people from around the world looking at the Mona Lisa, and they measured their eye saccades, the little eye movements we use to scan. And people from China, their eyes were going all up and down the picture. And people from the US, our eyes were looking at the eyes and the mouth of the Mona Lisa and nothing else. And so we scan the world differently based on culture, but it's all unconscious. So there are a lot of different flows into the unconscious.
But the implicit menace in the more sophisticated we get in terms of social science and studies about what determines how we'll behave, it's a threat to the liberal instinct that we are all perfectible and that we are all equally capable of achieving great things. If we attribute so much to our culture, to our, as you write a good deal about parenting, how we've related to our parents in our first few months, the impulse to track, to profile, to slot young people into a future becomes that much greater and supported by science. Respond.
Yeah, well, the science puts bounds on free will. There's limits to it, but it doesn't go away, in part because, as I mentioned, we have the power to educate our emotions. We have the power to decide what context we're going to live in. We can join the Marines or go to college, and we won't be aware of how those institutions shape us, but they will shape us. We choose our environment. And then, most importantly, the brain is incredibly plastic all through life. And so one of the things that I dwell on in the book is scientists at the University of Minnesota did this fantastic longitudinal study and found they could take kids at 18 months, see how they related to mom, and they could predict with 77% accuracy who's going to graduate from high school. Because if at 18 months you've established a two-way relationship with mom, you not only have that relationship, you have a model in your head for how to establish relationships. So when you go to school, you'll know how to establish a relationship with teacher, and you just have a huge advantage. But nonetheless, nothing that happens at 18 months or 20 years or 40 years or 60 years locks you in. They have a mentor at age 10, that can make up for early deficiencies. And so all through life, even up to age 70, the brain is creating new neurons and experience is having an effect. So it limits free will, but it certainly doesn't, did I say something?
I don't know whether some neurons that it.
It's up to 90, by the way.
90's the new 70?
In fact, there's a Proust, when he was dying, got up from his deathbed, or actually couldn't get up, but he dictated a new death scene in one of his books because he said, this is how it is. And he wanted to re-edit.
So if we woke you up in the middle of the night and shook you, say, "Are you liberal?" You would say, "No."
Yeah, I'll tell it because some people here may have been in New York, but the story I tell about me being conservative, I was going to Grace Church School when I was a kid down here. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir at Grace, where we would sing, but we would not, to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. So the volume would drop in the hymns, and then it would come up after. And my parents, I was 5, and they took me to a be-in in Central Park, and a be-in was where hippies would go just to be. And as part of their being, they would put a garbage can on fire, threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, and I reached up, grabbed it, and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. But the kind of conservative I think I am is actually kind of New Yorkish. First, I'm a Burkean, and the phrase there is epistemological modesty, to know how little we know about the world and how careful we should be about planning. And I actually grew up in a culture, and I say it's New Yorkish, the phrase was think Yiddish, act British. And so there was sort of an Anglophilic Jewish culture here, where all the parents gave their kids names which they thought were quintessentially English and nobody would ever associate with Judaism, and they were names like Sidney, Milton, and Irving. And of course, they immediately became Jewish names. But
Irving Place, just downtown,
Yeah, right.
is an early Irving.
And so that's the first part, the Burkeanism, which is modesty about planning. And Obama has great faith in planning, which I'll never have. And then the second, I say it here, Hamiltonianism. Very quickly, Alexander Hamilton. We have the current conservatives are very Jeffersonian, limiting government to enhance freedom, and the current liberals are, I don't know what, but they're very believe in using government to enhance equality. And so those are the two main strains in American politics. But there are 6 of us in the country who believe in Hamiltonianism, which is limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. So giving people the tools to compete in a capitalist economy, but keeping it a pretty free capitalist economy. And there are very few of us who believe that, but I'm one of them. So I'm in I think, a conservative strand that used to exist in American life, but no longer really exists as much.
So, we're both from Washington, which is consumed with an interesting experiment in human behavior that's going on right now. And I just wonder how you, particularly given your interest in understanding human behavior better, how you make sense of what we're going through every week with them, trying to reconcile our hopes about what we think we can afford as a country, what we don't want to pay for as a country, what we can't really afford.
Yeah, I have a vast meta theory that would take me 20 minutes to sketch about why we're in this mess fundamentally. I fundamentally think it's not a Washington problem, it's a national problem, it's a cultural problem. And the short answer is we went from a culture, I think, that emphasized citizenship to the expense of individualism in the 50s, say, or World War II generation, to a culture that emphasized individualism at the expense of citizenship through the 60s and the 80s, these 2 cultural revolutions. And as a result, 2 things happened. One, people, even in the 30s, FDR had a strong incentive not to, they wanted to spend a lot of money, but you could see them in the 30s viscerally reacting against the idea that they were going to put costs on future generations, because they saw themselves as part of a chain of generations, and they had a visceral horror against that. Now, in a much more individualistic culture, we've lost that horror, and now we want more government than we're willing to pay for. I'm just going to throw in one statistic to illustrate this cultural change. In 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, "Are you a very important person?" And 12% said yes. In 2005, they asked the same question, and 80% said yes. So there's been a shift, are you a very important person? And as a result of that shift, people want to spend on themselves as befits their station, and they have less of a sense of common citizenship. And I think that's the fundamental problem. And so I think what politicians are, they generally want to do the right thing. They can read the numbers. They now know how unaffordable the course we're on. But the politics of it are the politics of it. And they're trying to meld what they think is responsible from what is politically survivable. And when I look at Paul Ryan, I think he's vastly overconfident in his ability to sell his program. Whatever you think of the program, and I think in some ways it's responsible, in some ways I don't like it, but it is politically suicidal, I think. And I've had
turned Medicare into a voucher program.
Yeah, and he really would. I think I don't necessarily agree with the way he does it, but it is certainly a fact that seniors and middle-class people have to pay more if they want to keep these programs. That's just a fact. And he says, yeah, we'll make them pay more this way. But I don't think they want to pay more. And I think they will punish you for asking them to pay more. And so I've had a debate with him, and I said, look at the polls, it's crazy. And he says, look, I win in my district. Obama carried my district in Wisconsin, and I win.
Yeah. But to paraphrase a past president, it also depends what the meaning of "they" is. That is, they don't want to pay more, but on the other hand, during the Wisconsin budget battle, actually I put this to you on the air, there was a poll asking Wisconsin voters, what about raising taxes for people with incomes over $150,000? And it was over 72% said, yeah, that's a good element of a solution to do that. It's just been taken off the table by Paul Ryan.
That's right.
They will not consider it as being part of the answer.
Right. No, I agree with that. And my problem with Wisconsin was I think we need to cut, but we need to have a few principles about cutting. One of them is that everybody should have to suffer as much as possible. Whereas in Wisconsin, Walker just asked his political opponents to suffer. Well, that's going to undermine any sense of common purpose. And then we have to cut in a way that is that cuts consumption and rewards investment, that cuts seniors and rewards young families. And now we're doing the opposite. The one final psychological thing I'll say, and this is about Obama, he knows the reality of it. But I saw him last week, and it's interesting how he's got many features that are off the charts, good and bad. But one of them is self-confidence. He's the most self-confident person I've ever met in my life. I'm convinced that the word Obama will be the unit of measure for self-confidence in 80 years. It'll be like he's got 120 Obamas, he's got 190 Obamas. But the other thing one sees in him now is the fierce competitiveness. He's a very competitive person. And now, because he's getting into campaign mode, it was for 2 or 3 years he was very much in governing mode, very calm, and okay, we'll do this. Now he's got the competitive juices flowing, and now it's just, let's beat the crap out of Ryan and Republicans. And you see that, the sort of competitive juices overtaking everything else.
Does he have any serious opposition for the nomination? Somebody who obviously looms out there as the person who could take the White House from him?
You mean a Democrat?
No, a Republican.
Oh, Republican. I don't think so. Jim Steinberg's, I assume, will serve in the Trump administration. He'll do 2 years here, and then I'll go off back to the Trump. I think it's a weak field for obvious reasons. I think most Republicans say it's a weak field. I think the strongest Republican candidate is Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana. I like him because he's 5'6", low to the ground, in touch with the people. I think only how many times in American history has a shorter candidate won? I'm trying to think.
Must have been Madison.
Carter beat Ford. I think he was shorter, but not too many. I would like to see a 5'6" guy win, but I'm not sure he's going to run. It's come either or. But the other candidates I think are weak, and just Obama's political positioning I think is very deft. It's sure we need to cut, but I'm not going to tell you where. I'll appoint a commission and they'll come up with some cuts. I think that's the political sweet spot in terms of cutting. And so I think he's just a strong candidate on many grounds.
Well, if he's a strong candidate at the top of the ticket in 2012, and if the Republicans don't have a very strong field, is the huge Republican majority in the House likely to be reduced, do you think? Not that I'll hold you to your answer. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's a guess, but not that maybe likely to be reduced. But the people, I don't study this for a living. I mean, I pay attention, but I know people who study every congressional district on earth, and we know these people.
Yeah.
And if you go to Charlie Cook or Michael Barone or these people, and you say, well, how's the Wisconsin third race looking to you? You could pick any race in the country. They'll say, oh, well, the Kozlowski's moved off Maple Street, so that's 3 fewer Democrats. And then, I mean, they just know it to incredible. And my sense is they think there's relatively little danger of the Republicans losing control of the House, and some possibility of them picking up the Senate because there are far, far, far more Democrats up this year than there are Republicans in the Senate. And so there's a natural Republican advantage there. But did they predict the Republicans taking over last time? Probably not at this point. So,
Before we take questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you about your education, since you've written a good deal about education. I mean, you have a bachelor's degree. You're dear to the heart those of us who are unlettered beyond the AB. But also, you learned a lot from covering things and from being a journalist. Is it which I think for most of us who work in journalism, it's kind of an undisciplined, random way of learning a tremendous amount of things about a tremendous amount of things. Do you think of that as your formation?
yeah, I mean, I learned in college that I don't think very well in abstractions. I need examples. And so going off, and I thought I was going to be a novelist or a playwright. And I worked for a thing called the Chicago Review, and our only pleasure in life was rejecting short stories from Joyce Carol Oates, I remember. But in the course of that, I became a reporter for the the City News Bureau of Chicago, which is a wire service. And I just did it because I needed a job. And
it's a fabled institution.
Yeah, fabled.
In
So
Chicago.
we would, in Chicago, they do not have press rooms in police buildings. So we just sat, when the detectives got up, we just sat in their desks. And then when they came back, we found another desk. We were right there with them. And as a result, they loathed us. They used to throw us back in lockup with the prostitutes and did horrible, horrible things to us. But my first day on the job, there were a lot of things happened. My first day, a kid committed suicide. I had to call all the neighbors. And so I never took the phrase journalistic ethics too seriously after that, because it was snooping. But you just learned about reality, you got to see things. And then I remember I covered an incredible number of stupid people. Criminals in general, not the smartest people. I remember I covered a bunch of guys who broke out of jail, got hungry, there was a McDonald's across the street. They went to the McDonald's and sat in the window and ate their burgers. And the cops are running out of the jail, and there they are sitting there. And so I covered, but in the course of journalism, I always tell journalism students, if you're in a football stadium and the crowd is doing the wave, and you're the sort of person who doesn't get up and do the wave, you just sit there, then you should be a journalist, because you have the sort of aloof personality that's right for the profession. And we don't get to take part in anything, but we get, in the course of my career, you've actually been around many more people than I have, but I've got to meet Mandela, Reagan, Thatcher, Gorbachev, all these people.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Pedro Martinez.
That I've never had. That would be a peak. One doesn't want to peak too soon.
He's a very charming guy. Should we be funding the educational system that is miseducating America by your lights, that is not teaching us the right way to succeed?
Well, let me first say, Pedro Martinez, the best interview I ever had in my life was Jackie Gleason. I was in a hotel room in Miami, and his wife walked in, pushed a $24 cassette recorder, and with Tonight Show music, da-da-da-da-da, and then in walks Jackie Gleason. I'm just sitting there alone in a room, and for an hour and a half, he tells me great stories. So that was fun.
These are the real joys of journalism.
And the educational system, I think we should be funding it from this research. I spent a lot more time thinking about early childhood education than I did before. I care about that more than anything else. I think it really is the way to have the biggest bang for the buck. I also think one of the themes of the research is that the things we think are soft and squishy are actually hard and practical. And so I'm generally very optimistic about education reform, more so than any other part of government right now, because we've had all these reforms since the Nation at Risk report, and they were all disappointing because they skirted the core issue, which was the individual relationship between a teacher and a student. And we're now actually doing reforms that work on that relationship. And so the stuff that Michelle Rhee was doing and Joel Klein, the stuff that KIPP schools are doing, the Harlem Children's Zone, all this stuff is really focusing on the core issue. And there are great early childhood educations programs that are around the country. Head Start needs to be reformed, but it's important. And so all that stuff is really burbling forth. My only concern is that as we cut, we're going to cut based on an old version of human capital, which says the things we can count and measure are the things that matter. All this stuff is peripheral. And so we'll focus on the reading and math, which is important, but we'll cut the art and music because we think that's peripheral. But if you pay attention to the emotions, that's actually central. And then, you know, I met a guy at Sacramento not long ago. He said, the way I keep my kids in school is through the ABCs, athletics, band, and cheerleading. And if you cut those things, you lose a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I would rearrange the funding, but I would keep funding.
Okay. We have a gentleman with a microphone, and he's going to find folks with their hand up. It's your call. Why don't you identify yourself?
Yes, Bill Paul, New York Presbyterian Hospital, and a member of the Maxwell Advisory Board, which I'm very proud of. A couple questions on health reform as it was ultimately enacted. In other words, the total package of health reform. The Affordable Care Act, ACA. Are there parts of it that you think are good and fundamentally sound? And I guess more importantly, do you think it reflects this larger American culture that you're trying to understand and express in your book? And finally, is it a left wing, right wing, or middle of the road construct?
Yeah. Well, you know, there are parts I like. I like the exchanges. I like the cuts in Medicare. But you know, I was a big fan of the sainted Wyden-Bennett plan, which would have created more choice while mandating coverage.
Would have unhinged insurance from employment, essentially.
It would have, yes. So politically kind of tough to do. But I thought that was the way to go. It gotten rid of the exemption for tax insurance or for health and care insurance. Politically very tough. But I thought that was more in touch with the country because it emphasized choice. And the public reaction against the health care plan was a reaction against a lot of things, but primarily a reaction against the sense that people did not hear the rhetoric of choice and individual responsibility. What they heard, and they were accurate about this, was that there were going to be boards of people in Washington, and it became stupid. It became death panels and all that stuff. For the record, I'm pro-death panels. But the president really has a much greater faith than I do in boards of smart people getting together and devising solutions. So they have great confidence in this board to reduce Medicare costs. And they've, even in his last speech, he gave them even more power. I'm really dubious that boards are smart enough to plan the healthcare system and plan cost reductions. Unelected boards can impose these horrible choices on people from Washington. I'm very skeptical of that. So essentially, we have this situation where Medicare and the rest of the healthcare system is not going to be able to afford to pay for all the new things technology is coming up with. So how are we going to ration, if you want to use that word? Well, either we could have a centralized board do it, which is what happens in a lot of places and what they choose, or we could have some sort of market-based mechanism do it. And obviously some people say the market-based mechanism doesn't work. And so the question is, who's going to make the decisions, the individuals or the boards? And there's probably some mix that we'll end up with. But I was a little disturbed by the tremendous emphasis on centralized boards of technocratic decision makers.
Okay. There's a question when we work our way over this way.
Hi, Dan Rose. David, if infants can be trained to prefer 2 marshmallows later rather than 1 marshmallow earlier, isn't that an argument, a powerful argument, a compelling argument in favor of massive preschool education for the dysfunctional poor?
Yes. You know, this is where the rubber hits the road for anybody. Dan is mentioning does everybody here know the marshmallow experiment? I'll assume everybody knows. It's an experiment where at age 4, they can tell with tremendous accuracy what your income is going to be at age 20 and age 30, based on how well you exercise self-control at age 4. And so basically, if you grow up in a middle-class home, you're likely, you don't need any. You've established relationship, you've lived up in a home where actions lead to consequences, and you've developed strategies to control your impulses. A lot of kids have not grown up in that kind of home. And so the public policy challenge is, do we want government very paternalistically going in and replacing the culture of disorganized homes? And I think a lot of us have an aversion to the idea of government going in and interfering in family life. And yet the generational cycles of poverty are such that I think we should take the risk on the side of paternalism. And the things that can do it are nurse-family partnerships or sort of the heavy intrusion of institutions like up at the Harlem Children's Zone. And I think it's worth interfering in family life. Some of the programs that work call themselves parent neutral, but what they're really doing is replacing the culture of the family with a different culture. And that's not libertarian, and it's dangerous, but I think it's probably worth it given the disorganization in many cultures, in many parts of the society. But we would have to acknowledge, which we're loath to acknowledge, that in a wildly unequal society, we need unequal or two sets of policies. And one set of policies for people who are growing up in disorganized cultures, and another set for those who aren't. And that's a tough thing politically to acknowledge in public.
But aren't we also living in a time now which is in a reaction in part to the ease with which the well-to-do intervened in the families, in poor families and the lives of the young, and felt much more confident to terminate parental rights for people who weren't there enough, and we've been living in a time of trying to counteract that, what was perceived as an arrogance. You're saying we should feel more comfortable with a more measured confidence.
Yeah, well,
not arrogance.
it's a very tough call. I mean, one of the things, again, my doubt of planners, you know, if you started as I did, covering the Robert Taylor homes or the Cabrini Green, the big projects in Chicago, we had planners come in thinking they saw these terrible neighborhoods, and they tore them down, and they put up these nice new buildings, but they didn't appreciate the neighborhoods looked terrible, but there were actually social support networks that the people had established. And when they tore down the old neighborhoods, they tore away those support networks, so the new buildings became uninhabitable. So as we interfere in family life, what are we tearing away unintentionally? That's a thing. But, you know, I go to these early childhood programs in Chicago and elsewhere, and the number of kids where you hear the stories of the kids, they've been sitting in car seats 8 hours a day in front of the TV. And mom's been putting Coke into the milk bottle just to get them to be quiet, because mom's under tremendous stressor and might be suffering some mental issues and things. And so you see this cycle repeating itself. Do you do nothing? Do you, I mean, how,
Yeah.
you know?
Let's move the microphone. Let's continue to move uptown here.
Hi, I'm George Perlov. I'm a strategic marketing and communications consultant. And to your point earlier about the society going from more of the larger focus on society to more of an individual focus, I'm wondering, can we ever regain that in this country? I know there was a glimmer of that, you know, after 9/11, which I think we all felt was really a lost opportunity. Could it happen again? And what would need to happen in this country to make that work?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of there was just an attack. There was an attack on conformity. I mean, this came to my mind actually. The thing that crystallizes it to me in story form. I was driving home one day, listening to NPR, the Saint Today NPR, and on our local station on WAMU on Sunday nights they have a broadcast called the Big Broadcast.
Big old-time radio shows.
Yeah, so it's old-time radio shows, and I happened to hear one night a show called Command Performance, which was a variety show that went out to the troops in World War II. And they had all the big stars on it. The episode I heard was VJ Day, 1945. Bing Crosby was the host, gets out there and says, just hours ago we've learned the Japanese are surrendering, but we don't feel proud at this moment. We just feel modest. We just feel glad we got through it. And this theme of modesty kept being echoed throughout the broadcast. Burgess Meredith gets out there in the middle, and he reads a passage from Ernie Pyle, the great war correspondent, and Pyle says, we won this war because we have great soldiers, brave allies. We didn't win it because we're God's chosen people. We didn't win it because we're special. We should just try to be worthy of the peace. Just incredible tone of modesty. And then I get home, turn on the TV, watch a football game, and a quarterback throws a pass to a wide receiver who gets tackled after a 2-yard gain, and the cornerback, the defensive player, does what all professional athletes do is he did a dance in honor of his own tremendous accomplishments. And it occurred to me I'd heard more self-puffery after the football game, 2-yard gain, than America did after winning World War II. And that sort of symbolized to me the transition from a culture of self-effacement, which says I'm no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than me, to I'm special. And that polling statistic, I said it earlier, is sort of part of that. And so these are deep cultural trends. The only thing I'd say in an optimistic way, and this is a 2/3 answer, is that people under 30 are tremendously community-oriented. If you look at social indicators for people under 30, the teenage pregnancy rate is down by 1/3, teenage violence is down, domestic violence is down, violent crime for teenagers is down, suicide rates are down. Incredibly wholesome and responsible generation. They're all going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years. But until then, so there are cycles to these things. What they don't have is an interest in politics.
David, your earlier comments with respect to brain research and complexity of it, et cetera, and the emotions, et cetera, and the view seemingly in Washington with respect to healthcare as basically being a commodity and can be, quote, counted in units. Would you describe your view of, quote, medical science, and I put that in quotes, and the ability to interpret virtually anything in a broad, general way from data, and then tie that up to your planning of all of our lives in healthcare?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in this particular thing, but I have seen various studies. The number of things that affect how somebody's going to recover from illness or their morbidity rates. Smoking is bad, but something that's really bad is loneliness. And how do we try to create cultures in which that doesn't happen? I saw a study of people suffering from illnesses in Italy where on one side of the hospital they had a view of basically brick walls. The other side of the hospital they had a view of this nice Italian scenery. And of course the people on the scenery side, their hospital stays were I think on average 3 days shorter. And so the idea, one of Descartes' errors, one of the themes of the book and of the research is that we're children of the French Enlightenment that said that reason is the king of our abilities and the mind is separate from the body. And we're now learning that research confirms the wisdom of, I think, the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume and people like that, which is reason is important, but weak sentiments are strong, and the body and the mind are all connected. And we still have a scientific, I think it's much less so than it used to be, but we still have a scientific establishment that still is more comfortable, like so many of our establishments, talking in these rational terms just of the mind, not of the connection between the two. I think that's changing a bit as the research comes in and as women become more. A lot of this is male-dominated. And as women become more part of ruling structures, then that changes a little. One final medical study that comes to mind, they gave a bunch of a bunch of doctors look at the same symptoms at a patient, and they gave half of them a bag of candy, Halloween candy, and half of them no candy. The doctors who got the bag of candy were much, much more accurate in their diagnoses of the liver ailment. And so all these things feed into how we think. But we should all give them candy. We have a lot of fat doctors.
But the question that I'm reminded of by this question was, and I put this to President Obama in an interview actually, because he insisted that if people know that a test isn't necessary, they won't go have tests. Right. And this happened right after the mammogram release, in which women were told these tests are not necessary, and the reaction was not, oh, well, good, I'll go back and recalculate what's necessary. It's, do I trust the people who are telling me this? What's their motive for telling me that? Right. How is this done? And Obama said, what's the way in which that news was presented? But it was not a simple rational factor saying you no longer have to have a test, don't do it.
Well, in New York City, they now have the calorie counts on the menus, and they expected the calorie intake that people ordered would go down, but in fact it went up. And so there's a mystery. It could be people just react in ways we don't anticipate. It could be that some people just decided not to order at all, so they left. So you got only the heavy orderers ordered. So I'm not quite sure how to analyze that data, but things are not as predictable as one thinks.
Charlotte, you have the...
I'm Charlotte Frank with McGraw-Hill. My question has to do with people influencing other people and Obama. Now, Michelle Obama is a really smart lady. I mean, forgetting about that, she's gorgeous, but she's a really smart lady, lawyer, all of that. What influence do you think that women have, or she might have, on the decisions of the husbands, the men, the president?
Yeah, my general experience of White Houses is the influence of the First Lady is they're always tougher than their husbands. Their influence is very hard to read from the outside until afterwards. So I had a friend of mine who worked in the last administration. They were at Buckingham Palace, and he was a senior official with Bush. And they were at a cocktail reception at Buckingham Palace for the Queen, and Bush was bored out of his mind. And Bush said to my friend, "Let's get out of here. Let's sneak around the palace. I want to see this place." And Laura was right there, and she pointed to my friend and said, "Don't you do that." And so he had to choose, do I obey the president or the First Lady? And he told me it wasn't even close. And my impression in this White House, too, is that she's much tougher and more feared. And that's actually works both ways. The president, even within the administration, is not feared enough. I often ask people in the government, what have you learned being in this time that you didn't know before? And one of the answers I got was that you would be amazed by how little the sentence, "the president made this decision," matters in a meeting. So at a meeting of the deputies, the president will have rendered a decision. Somebody will say, "This is what Obama wants," and they'll nod, and then they'll go off as if that sentence was not uttered. And so the president, I think, has to render the same decision 6 or 7 times, because the first few times nobody pays attention. This is a common problem with presidents, that they all express this. But I don't think too many people are not unafraid of Michelle Obama. I think they're afraid of her, as they were afraid of Laura, as they certainly were of Barbara Bush and Nancy Reagan. And probably Hillary, yeah. Now that I think about it, it's a straight trend. The husbands are the softies. They want to be loved by everybody.
Let's get another question. Do we have a hand up?
Kind of a job do you think the press is doing reporting on the major issues of the day, aside from the partisan political back and forth? And let me just give you one example. We often hear that Medicare is described as a very efficient system because it has low administrative costs. And yet, in the next breath, we also hear that it's rife with massive fraud and abuse and erroneous payments, and it's going to go broke. Those two thoughts can't be held simultaneously. And why isn't the press doing a better job of pointing that out?
Well, I guess it's because the experts aren't doing a great job of coming to a conclusion. One of the problems we face in these sorts of issues is that there's no consensus in the field. And it's very hard as a journalist to figure out where the center of gravity is in any field of experts. And so I'll call up, I'm sure you have this experience, you call up 6 different healthcare economists. They tell you 6 different things. It's very hard and they all have some piece of the truth. And so it's phenomenally hard to cover fields where you're calling up experts and they differ because the fields are so complicated. I think in general, the debate on healthcare was a pretty good debate. I think we all learned a lot about the healthcare system in the course of that debate. It had its death panel moments, of course. But I think in general it had people, I remember thinking this when they had that Blair House summit with the president and all the members. I thought that they were much more up to speed than they were a year before. So would I say it's perfect? No, but I do think on that issue, I think the press, to the extent you can generalize, did a reasonably decent job. And then I have to say this about my own newspaper. I think on Libya we've done and those sorts of issues we've done a phenomenal job. Every time I open my newspaper, and I have nothing to do with any of this, there's always some really excellent reporting that somebody's been doing. And NPR too. I think there are a number of tremendous outlets. out there. It doesn't mean most of the people listen to this, but they're out there. I'm not nostalgic about the press of the 50s or 60s or 70s. I think the press is better now than ever before.
Let's bring a mic forward to Mitch Wallerstein here.
David, you mentioned earlier that you thought that Obama was guilty of excessive reliance on planning. Many in the media have also criticized him for not being, as it's sometimes referred to, a closer, that he's good on proposing ideas and putting them forward, but doesn't seem to always be able to close the deal. Do you see that as related to being too worried about triangulation, or does he really not have the instinct for putting the hammer down when he needs to?
Well, I think within the administration there's some realization he doesn't have that. He doesn't have that Machiavellian inspire fear, which is sometimes necessary. But I generally don't understand. He is a proposer. There's no issue I've ever seen him confront where he didn't seek to transcend it and rise above the disputing parties. And that was started from the stimulus to health care, even to some of the foreign policy problems. The Middle East, it's always, I'm going to rise above and try to settle this. I think that's just naturally the way he thinks. But it means he's in some ways strangely passive. Even this budget thing. He gave a speech and he said, we're going to do cuts and here are my targets. And he said, in defense target, let's get a board of defense experts to figure out what to cut. Discretionary spending, here's my target. Let's have a commission figure out what to cut. Medicare, here's my target. Let's have another commission to figure out what to cut. He's never involved in the actual decision. It's a convening. And I do think that, I'm not sure why that is. At first I had a theory in the stimulus package why they gave so much power to Congress. My theory was they were having tremendous problem hiring people, which they were in the first 2 years. They refused to hire anybody who'd ever worked as a lobbyist, which was a big mistake because a lot of those people are really good and really knowledgeable. And second, they discovered that they had a great deal of trouble hiring because it turns out nobody in America pays their taxes. And so they would hire somebody and they'd say, would you like this job? And they'd say, yeah, I'd love that job. I have a little tax issue you should probably be aware of. And then they'd go to the next person, the same thing. And so they had a lot of trouble. So at first I thought it was just a staffing issue. But now I don't know. It's his instinct to transcend.
But there would be, at the end of the housing, at the end of the medical health care bill was something of an exception to that, and that the conventional wisdom was that it was time to usually scale back and compromise everything that they'd done for the previous year. And Obama was the guy who said, he just lost the 40th Senate seat. He said, we're on the 2-yard line. It's time to ram the ball through on the goal line.
That's true.
And they did.
Yeah, he did do that, and there were other people, including his chief of staff, saying, let's settle for half a loaf.
Settle for Rahm Emanuel was very much.
And so he did, and there have been times when he's gotten on the phone and called members of Congress and said, let's do this. But there's still a a delegation often, I think, compared to, say, Bill Clinton, who was much more, let's draw the lines on the map, let's sit here, let's do this, get into the details. Maybe that's a better way to run the administration, just be a convener, set the overall shape, and set it off. But it is an interesting contrast, especially with Clinton.
Well, David, this has been incredible fun, and it's great to talk with you for longer than the 6 minutes on the air on Friday, which we share with E.J. Dionne.
Yeah,
also.
E.J.'s hogging 5.5 of that.
He's a tough guy to battle for time with. And thanks for being with us. Congratulations on The Social Animal, and it's been fascinating.
Thank you, Robert.
Hi, Will Friedman from President of Public Agenda. I just want to thank Robert and David one more time. A great conversation. My Obama count has risen as I face the political season coming up. And thanks to the Maxwell School, our partners on these breakfasts, and the Public Agenda team for setting us up for this. We'd also like to invite you to our next breakfast. It's June 15th. Our guest will be former Ambassador Donald Gregg, currently the chairman of the Korea Society. He's has a distinguished career in foreign policy as a CIA officer, a member of the National Security Council, and ambassador to South Korea, and evidently was a model for a Tom Clancy character. So that'll be fun to probe as well. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you in the future.